Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. This is a non-judgmental place to explore spirituality, and we're so glad you're here. This is a viewer and listener-supported podcast, so we greatly appreciate your support. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure and like, share, and subscribe to any of the social media content platforms that you're using. And then if you go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, you can make a one-time donation, or with a monthly subscription, you'll gain access to our bonus content. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. We're glad you're connecting with us today. I am honored. We have Dr. Stephen Patterson on our podcast today. And Steve, I read your book, The Forgotten Creed. Mm-hmm. Hadn't read anything else that you've done, which I've now got a read list of yours now that I want to get to. But I loved it so much. I thought, gosh, I'm going to try to see if I can find his email address and see if I can do an interview with him. And I was shocked that you got back to me and said you'd do it. So thanks so much for doing this.
You're welcome. I'm glad to. Glad to be part of your program.
So Steve is a professor at Willamette University, which is in Oregon. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Which city is it in? Yeah.
It's in Salem, Oregon, in the capital.
Salem.
We call it Willamette, and it rhymes with damn it, so we say Willamette, damn it.
Yeah. But I love to start with a little bit of your sort of origin story so our audience can get to know you. But you are a well-known origins of Christianity professor, have been associated with the Jesus Seminar, but have done tons of work on the origins of Christianity. So you've hung out with people like John Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg, and all kinds of folks. I love this book. Like, if I could have my evangelical friends read The Forgotten Creed, I would buy them a copy and send it to them if they'd read it.
Well, you're welcome to do that, of course.
But tell us about yourself. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? And then, give us a little bit of your educational and family history just on the front end of this interview.
Well, I was born in Texas, in Dallas Fort Worth. Fort Worth was my first home, and my father was a minister, a Disciples of Christ minister, as I said a moment ago to you, and I went to TCU. Both my mom and dad went to TCU, but they were involved in the civil rights, and so by 1958 they were literally run out of Texas. And so landed in Illinois. And then we moved around the Midwest quite a lot. My father had a little, trouble settling, of course. He was a young person in turbulent times. And finally found a home in South Dakota, where I did some of my growing up. So we think of South Dakota as a really conservative place now, but then it was kind of a free-thinking place, and everybody had a place there. That was my growing up as a preacher's kid in various small towns in the Midwest. So I guess that part of my life was fast living and trying to prove myself, prove to people that I wasn't as straight-laced as my father. But I went to college and had a kind of a normal college experience. A little college in South Dakota called Yankton College, that is now a federal prison. I like to throw that in, unless you think I have great academic credentials. Yeah. But it was a great place to grow up and meet people from all over the country. And
was it a state school or a private school? Was it state school or private?
It was a private school, a little congregational college, kind of like those other congregational schools out there, like Doane and Carleton and Grinnell. Very, sort of progressive kind of place. And then I went to Harvard Divinity. I met my wife there, and we've been married for 45 years now.
Wow.
And
Congratulations.
then we went off to graduate school together. Went to Harvard for my theological degree. And
What years were you at Harvard?
I was there from 1981 to 83.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
And then went to Claremont to do a PhD, and did my PhD on the Gospel of Thomas, and I've been working on that over the years pretty steadily. So that's one area that I've kind of developed some extra expertise in. But then I landed a job at Eden Seminary, which was a big stroke of luck. Eden Seminary in St. Louis, and I taught there for more than 20 years. And during that time, I got connected with the Jesus Seminar. Bob Funk had reached out to me because of my expertise on the Gospel of Thomas, and Crossan was interested in Thomas at the time too. And so I started with the Jesus Seminar in 1988, which was pretty close to the beginning, and did more or less the whole run with the Jesus Seminar. And that experience kind of transformed me. I've never had a kind of awakening experience or any kind of crisis experience in my life related to faith, but the Jesus Seminar was a real awakening to me because it helped me connect the historical work that I was interested in doing with issues in our culture. And I discovered that you can be a engaged historian, and I would say make a real difference, but you don't really make a difference as an academic. You just don't. It's just too small of a swing. But you can feel like you're participating in the larger discourses going on in our country, and so I learned to connect what I was learning from about Jesus, which I was learning a lot, and with what's going on in our civilization, and I've been doing that sort of thing more or less since. This book that you're interested in, The Forgotten Creed, is not about Jesus. It's about a response to Jesus, an early response to Jesus that we encounter in one of Paul's letters. But it is I think, a genuine response to Jesus, and one that picks up a strain of the Jesus tradition that's very important and often neglected, usually neglected in our circles.
Yeah. Yeah. So you met your wife in South Dakota. Do you guys have kids, grandkids?
We have two children. Yeah, we have two children. They're grown now. One of them lives with us. She has special needs and will always live with us. And so we're very fortunate that our daughter will never go off and leave us alone with an empty nest. We're very happy about that. And our son has a degree from Willamette University, where I teach now, and lives in Portland and is having a great life up there. So
that's awesome. And your wife is a senator? Is she currently?
Yes, she's an Oregon senator. Yeah.
Yeah. Deborah Patterson. And is she also a pastor as well? Is she pastor?
Yeah, she's a UCC, a United Church of Christ minister, okay, and has a DMin, an MDiv and a DMin, and served churches. And most of her life, though, was spent in health administration. She administered a big hospital in St. Louis that was connected to the United Church of Christ, called Deaconess Hospital, and then helped to found the Deaconess Foundation, which did health advocacy, especially for children in St. Louis in the urban core. So most of her life is doing that. She kind of semi-retired out here, and she pastored a small country church, which we loved, for several years. But then in 2016, she heard the call to enter politics, and so we've been on that ride ever since. Yeah.
All right. Well, cool. Well, let's jump into this book. But before we get to the Forgotten Creed, you've done a lot of work with the Gospel of Thomas and some of the other I don't know what the right words for those are,
Yeah.
but I remember, I've read Elaine Pagel's and some of her work, but hadn't dove into those like you have. And it was just fascinating to me as I was reading the Forgotten Creed and how you integrated into, some of the history and context. You relied on some of those, like the Gospel of Thomas and some of the stories in the Gospel of Mary, and just several of those. Why would, like, if you just think about people listening here who read the Bible and, probably don't go much beyond that. Why is it, for the put it in layman terms, why is it important to read some of those other gospels? And what have you, I can gather just by reading this book, some of the things you've gleaned from that and how it has affected, your understanding of the New Testament. But for lay people, why should they probe into some of these texts?
Well, Jesus was a very dynamic figure, and people who experienced him firsthand had a lot of big reactions. And those reactions, those interpretations of Jesus drew from all kinds of cultural traditions in the ancient world. And what we have in the New Testament is a slice of that, a relatively small slice. But in the New Testament itself, you have a lot of diverse reactions to Jesus coming to voice. Absolutely, a lot of diversity there too. But the diversity of early Christianity is even greater than that. And so, as an historian, I really need I feel I need to have a handle on all those different responses to Jesus. One thing, I'm interested in Jesus as an historical figure. And I don't think you can get a good handle on Jesus just by reading one slice of the interpretation of Jesus, that which we have in the New Testament. So I think, as an historian interested in Jesus, I have to read a lot of different things, a lot of different reactions to Jesus to get a little better idea of where the vectors meet in a historical figure.
Yeah.
But then, it's interesting also how people reacted to Jesus and what kinds of things they said in response to him. And what we have in the New Testament is pretty much a martyrdom kind of reaction to Jesus. He was a kind of hero who died for something he believed in, and therefore, for early followers of Jesus, especially those living in the Roman Empire, the idea that you would trust your life to a cause like that, and that was a very meaningful thing for people to relate to, especially because I don't want to overplay the idea that early Christians were persecuted, but they were countercultural, they were dissidents, and so his life of the end of his life, especially the death of his death at the hands of the Roman Empire, was a meaningful thing for them to try and relate to and get a grip on. And so the death and resurrection of Jesus was basically a martyrdom narrative that says, give your life to this, and God will recognize you, will reward you in the end. And that's perfectly fine and ennobling. But I think over the course of Western civilization, that narrative has become kind of a problem. People, instead of really giving themselves to a cause, they give themselves to Jesus and expect their sins to be forgiven for that. And that's the narrative. It's kind of a martyrdom narrative, but it's using martyrdom language in a way that is out of context. So I'm interested in other narratives, other ways of thinking about Jesus. In the Gospel of Thomas, you have a tradition that thinks about him as a sage, as a wise person who can help you plumb the depths of human existence and experience. And it's a kind of Platonizing narrative. Ironically, if you look at the breadth of early Christian literature and ask, well, where do people start to think about souls? and the idea that you have a body and a soul that goes to heaven.
Yeah.
Well, you don't find that in the New Testament very much. You find it in the Gospel of Thomas for the first time in early Christian literature, a non-canonical or apocryphal or heretical book.
Well, it's not really in the Hebrew Bible.
It's not in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
And we read it into the New Testament, but it's hard to wedge it in there. It really is.
All right. So let's talk about the Forgotten Creed. Like, even when I was my evangelical pastor self preaching the Bible, I always thought, gosh, what if this Galatians 3:26 through 28 was our central piece of Pauline teaching?
Yeah.
And I thought, wouldn't we be doing a lot better in the world with issues of justice and all kinds of things, if that were our center point versus, some of the other center points. And so that's what really attracted me to your book. And then I love the subtitle, Christianity's Original Struggle Against Bigotry, Slavery, and Sexism. So your first chapter, you talk about, you kind of dissect this creed as it appears in Paul.
Uh-huh.
Share with us, briefly, like you came to the conclusion that some of it was what Paul put into a creed that was older than Paul, and you came to then you ended up summarizing, or not really summarizing, you ended up stating what you felt like was probably the original creed, and how that differed slightly from what we see in Paul in Galatians. So what got you into this in the first place, in terms of wanting to build a whole book around this?
Mm.
And then how did you dissect this little creed to come up with what you feel like was maybe the original?
Yeah. Well, I'll talk just a moment about how I got into it. I assume that some of your listeners probably have a Bible handy, and we'll pull it out and just look it up. We'll do a little exegesis here in a minute. But this is, of course, a well-known piece of tradition, and I taught it for many years. It was a stopping point and a checkpoint in my introduction to the New Testament for seminarians. But and I would have them read a section of a book by Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza called "In Memory of Her," which is a good sort of treatment of the text. But it's 10 pages or so, and I was surprised to learn when a few years I was looking around for something to sink my teeth into, and realized that there wasn't at that point a book on this creed. There were books on parts of the creed, ironically, just parts of it though, and not really looking at the creed as a whole. And so I thought, well, that's long overdue, and I've wanted something to direct students to over the years and didn't have it. So that's been a lot of my writing, is really creating things that I could use in class. So that's how I got interested in it. When I finished the book and it came out, we were in the midst of a real cultural crisis with the beginning of the Trump years. And people assumed that I wrote the book for that reason, but that wasn't it at all. It was just low-hanging fruit on a topic that I thought needed to be written about a little bit more, and more for a little bit more of a general audience than it typically is. But then it became very relevant to our our cultural situation, our political crisis, the rise of racism and sexism in ways that we just had thought were completely off the table. Suddenly they were back, and they were in power. And so I felt this was now part of the conversation. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The exegesis of it, if people have their text open now and look at it, Paul does this quite a lot. He drops things into his letters, little pieces of tradition. Many people think he had a rhetorical school in Ephesus, where he and others sort of created these kinds of things and crafted them, if you will, so that they could use them in their speeches and their preaching. And this may have been something like that, but most people think it was a baptismal creed created and used in a baptismal ceremony. And so for that reason, also a lot of scholars think that Paul didn't create this creed. He wasn't a baptizer. He reluctantly says he may have baptized a few people in Corinth, if you recall the opening lines of 1 Corinthians. But he uses it in Galatians because of the first of the three sort of dyadic statements here. There is no Jew or Greek. And there is no Jew or Greek is the theme of the epistle to the Galatians. And it is also the theme of Paul's ministry, his life, his what he was doing with the Jesus tradition. He was trying to break down an ethnic boundary that, after you've read the Forgotten Creed, you'll know was quite a deadly one in Paul's own day and time. Mm-hmm. But the fact that it has not just Jew or Greek, it's got slave or free and male and female in there also, shows us that the creed itself was about an issue that was broader, something more. Mm. And that issue is about how do we, as human beings, divide ourselves up into teams, tribes, clans, groups, and face off. So anyway, that's the relevance of it. My own work, people do reconstruct it differently, and some will agree with me, some don't. And my big move was to take 27 and set it aside. Verse 27: "For you, as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ." Mm-hmm. I think that's Paul's comment on the creed. He's reminding them that it was a baptismal creed, and that if they were baptized at some time, that they would have said this and so believed it. So it's kind of a rhetorical way of saying, take this seriously. You took it seriously once, take it seriously now, again. So I think 27 is Pauline commentary, and that leaves us with, "For you are all sons of God," or children of God, I would say, "through faith in Christ Jesus." And then the three, there is no Jew or Greek, no slave or free, no male and female. And then repeating that first line again, "For you are all one in Christ Jesus." The term Christ Jesus, from an exegesis and from a historical point of view, is suspect because it has a very Pauline ring to it. Only Paul uses that particular phrase, that title for Jesus. Everybody else says Jesus Christ or Jesus the Christ. Only Paul says Christ Jesus. And so that sounds real Pauline. And so I think that he probably also added "in Christ Jesus" in the first line and in the last line. So originally it said, "For you are all children of God through faith. There is no Jew or Greek, no slave or free, no male and female, for you are all one." And then as I read that, you just probably heard me say, "For you are all sons of God through faith." And through faith, is also a very Pauline phrase and a Pauline theme. And so finally, I decided that probably is also Pauline addition, Pauline editorializing on the creed. And it probably just began, "For you are all children of God."
And then you think in the Spirit.
Maybe in the Spirit is part of it. I get pushback from scholars on that because that's also kind of a Pauline thing. And the reason I suggested it is because when Paul alludes to the creed in another letter in Romans, he throws in a reference to the Spirit. And also the early Christian baptism was often associated with a kind of ecstatic experience where the imparting of the Spirit is part of the deal. And so I think that's a good reason to consider it anyway. But it's not critical. I think what's critical is the idea of this central triadic statement. There is no Jew or Greek. There is no slave or free. There is no male and female. Breaking down these these basic ways by which we divide the human community into ethnic groups, into class structure, and finally into gender identities. This is something that this creed identified right at the get-go as something very problematic about our human habits. This tendency to divide, and especially along these lines. And this is a problem that has haunted us and haunted every human community through all of time. I don't mean to be too universalizing on this, but it's probably true.
Yeah.
That every civilization has struggled with this, and ours is struggling with it mightily right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Tribalism, and anybody outside our tribe's the enemy. Yeah.
Anybody that's different,
like us, anybody that's different, they're the enemy.
Yeah.
So you point out that there is no Jew or Greek instead of no longer. There is no slave or free instead of no longer. And there's no, and then you point out male, and then it switches instead of or female, it says and female, which you think is referenced back to Genesis 1. Just share about the no longer versus the no and the significance of that. And then the significance of male and female as well. But I want to hold off on a bigger discussion of the male and female because later. But just a brief comment about no longer, and then the male and female versus the male or female.
Yeah. Thanks for that close, careful reading of the book. So Paul sets up this insert in a conversation about it, which is kind of historical. Before you were that, now you're this. And so before the creed, he says, you are no longer this. You're no longer under a garden, he says. And so when he comes into the creed, translators tend to bring that no longer sort of historical narrative into the creed, so that Paul would be saying there is no longer Jew or Greek, something like that. But if you look at the Greek, it doesn't say that. It just doesn't. No longer is ukeni, and this is ukeni, and this is a different. This expression means there is not. There just isn't. It's a very emphatic "there is not" statement. So, to me, that was significant because to say there's no longer Jew or Greek would mean to say that there was a time when that was a valid claim, and now things have changed. And the creed is actually saying that never was a valid claim. There is no slave or free. There's no longer slave nor free. Well, maybe that suggests that there was a time when that was something made sense to people. And this creed says, no, that's not, never was, never, no way, no how. So I thought it was kind of important to point that out to people, that this is a kind of almost ontological statement, really, as opposed to a historical statement. Yeah. It's not that something happened to change this. It was that it is that it never was. Class distinctions never did make any sense.
Yeah. It's like a construct imposed upon humanity versus the ontological reality of humanity.
Well put. Very well put. Very well put. And then the last statement, there is no male and female, switches things up just a little bit, and it switches from there is no slave or free, no male or Jew or Greek. And this the last clause goes, there is no male and female. Yeah. And it's not man and woman, it's male and female. And this language, this Greek phrase mimics very precisely the Greek translation that most people would have used of the Hebrew scriptures in antiquity and Hellenistic antiquity at Genesis 1:27. Where
Septuagint stuff, right? That's how the Septuagint.
That's right. That's right. The Septuagint would have said in Genesis 1:27 that God created human beings in the image of God, male and female. He created them, and so that's kind of important to point out because early ancient Jews and some early Christians kind of focused in on Genesis 1:27, and instead of reading in male and female, he created them, they could read in some texts, male and female, he created him. Did you sense the difference?
Mm-hmm.
In suggesting that the first created human being was neither male nor female, but an androgyne, both male and female.
Yeah. You go into this a little more in depth in that chapter.
Yeah, it sounds weird to people today, but
if we get to chapter 6, I wanted to drill in on this a little bit. It's some fascinating stuff that you brought in on that in chapter 6. But yeah,
it sounds like a real going down a real rabbit hole today, but in each one it really wasn't, and so the idea in reading Genesis that way was that the problem with human beings began when God separated female from male, Eve from Adam. And so gendered existence begins. Mm-hmm. And that's where the trouble starts. It starts not with Eve being tempted, but with Adam and Eve being tempted. And they associated, thus begins our whole struggle with the evils of sex and those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. But that's how they read it. And so the idea was that if the trouble began with the splitting and gendering of humanity, then the solution would be to try to turn back the clock and become less gendered and reunite the genders sometimes they would do it ritually, sometimes they would do it just creedally, sometimes they would do it by men dressing like women or women dressing like men. I mean, it was different ways you could reenact this recapitulation of the genders.
Yeah, and in your book, chapter 6 dives into some of that a little bit more. Good stuff. So chapter 2, the old cliche. I think these two, first one from from possibly Socrates, and then the other one from the Jewish tradition. Yeah, give us, because certainly those are in the background of this creed, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Somebody had them in mind when they created the creed.
Right.
There's a common
for the audience what those are, those two.
Yeah. There's a common cliche in antiquity, and it goes like this. I thank God I was not born X but Y, A but B, C but D. And you can plug in whatever your prejudices are. But the most, you find this cliche in Hellenistic writers, and that is Greek writers who say something like, I'm glad that God created me. I thank the gods I was created, a Greek, not a barbarian, or a Roman, not a barbarian. And then male and female always gets in there, a man, not a woman, and slave and free always gets in there too, free and not a slave, or free and not a brute, or free and not an animal, or something like that. And so this cliche is definitely in the background of this creed. The creed was formed as a kind of counter statement to that well-known cliche. When people introduce it into the discourse, they often introduce it as a Jewish cliche because it is repeated in the Talmud. But that's really to shade the thing in the wrong way, I think. We shouldn't think of Christianity as a rebellion against Judaism. We should think of it as a Jewish rebellion against certain cultural trends that are still cultural trends that we struggle with today. And so, the creed was really formulated to counter this very common cultural idea that men are better than women, that free people are better than slaves or have it better than slaves, and that we are better than whoever it is we hate out there. Romans hated Gauls, Greeks hated the Barbaroi, the Persians mostly, and Jews hated Gentiles. I mean, it's just the same old story. It's the same old story.
And we live. We can live in fear of the other. I thought your last couple of sentences in chapter 2, but really it's all about the fear of difference and the power to assuage that fear through domination. Whoever composed this baptismal creed had the extraordinary wisdom to see through this pretense. There is another identity, another way to lay claim to human worth. We are all children of God. So you kind of set up chapter 3, but I think, I mean, we want one response to the other. Probably the most common historical response to the other is, oh, well, let's dominate and control. It's a power and status grab, right? And
thank you for reading that section, that passage. I think in this book, I leaned into the idea of the fear of otherness, and I think that is a big part of it. But I also now think that a part of the appeal of that old cliche and part of the appeal of dividing humanity by race, class, and gender is to create a kind of hierarchy and the possibility of dominance. And I think human beings like to be in that situation where, on the one hand, they have strong leaders to tell them what to do, but on the other hand, they've got people below them they can punch down on. So they don't mind taking orders as long as they get to dominate somebody else. And so I think that's a big part of this the claim of this creed also, that those structures of domination that feel so comfortable to us are a real problem. And we need to try to live beyond them.
And since my whole meltdown and everything that I described to you before we got on the air, and most of my audience know about all that, but I've revisited the process, guys like, Whitehead, Hartshorn, and Cobb, and all those guys, and kind of been very intrigued with, just the theology. I'm interviewing Tom Ward right after you today.
Oh, that's wonderful. Say hello for me.
Yeah.
To him. I love his work.
Yeah. I'm doing his new book called The Death of Omnipotence.
Yeah.
The dominating God who controls everything, right? The top-down white patriarchal authority of God, the church, and everything else. And so that's all been fascinating to me, because I think all of us who actually love Jesus in some way or another have an instinct for love as primary, right? But we don't always trace that out into all of our concepts of God or our concepts of human relationships. And so therefore we so quickly snap into these dominant power control, who's in charge, who has, well, good stuff. So then chapter 3, Children of God, which a lot of ways to dissect this, but it immediately, I did an exegesis of Genesis 1:27 in my PhD program. And, it was interesting because the use of the image of God in the Hebrew Bible is quite unique, that it was democratized, with everybody's in the image of God, and men and women are in the image of God. That was reserved for the king who was the image of God. It was an elite term for the kings of the ancient Near Eastern world. You can only find one text in old Egyptian text that actually had a democratized view of the image of God. Mm-hmm. Only one out of all the to date. I mean, I'm sure other scholars will find stuff, but hardly ever is it democratized like this. And then I think also this idea of the children of God being democratized. Everybody's a child of God. I remember I was in southern Lebanon and met with Sheikh Nabil, who is the supreme commander there. He's like considered a terrorist guy, but he's also a scholar, a theologian. And it was a small delegation. We met with him, and the first thing he opened with, "We're all children of God." And it's just like, good start point.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. Yeah.
But this is a good one.
I had a chapter on baptism that I took out because I didn't think that people would be interested in a book on baptism and a long discussion of the origins of baptism. But I kept in this part of it because I think that in Protestant Christianity, especially Calvinism, but Lutheranism as well, there's a very strong sense of the fallenness of humanity. Mm-hmm. And the reformers get this from a reading of Paul, and a reading of Paul that's filtered through Augustine. And it emphasizes the fallenness of humanity, and to the point of really discounting human effort at all to live a good life, to embrace a life filled with love and compassion for other people, and all that comes secondarily. It comes after you've admitted your utter failure, your total depravity, and thrown yourself on the mercy of God, who saves you as an act of grace, not because God loves you or likes you or anything else. It's just almost a capricious act of God. In the Calvinist tradition, where everything's predestined, it has nothing to do with you or how God feels about you. It's just God. It's God's whim.
Yeah.
And I think people feel like, I think it's much more common in our world for people to think of God as a judge, as a harsh judge, and that only by admitting your total depravity and submitting to God completely and totally is there any hope for you. And this is a different idea. You are children of God. And that implies a lot of things. It implies, one, you are children of God. God loves you because God, everybody loves their children. Secondly, you're children of God. That makes you God-like in a sense. You are the offspring of God, and that's exactly how Jesus teaches it in the Sermon on the Mount. When you act and think like God, you are children of God. Mm-hmm. When you love people who don't love you, you're acting like God, and that makes you a child of God. Mm-hmm. So it has everything to do with your efforts to really become more and more like God. Mm-hmm. In American Protestantism, that's anathema. You don't become like God. Nobody becomes like God. God is in a class by God alone, and Jesus is in a class alone. You're not part of that world at all.
Yeah.
In the Eastern tradition, Eastern Christian traditions, though, there is a strong idea that you contemplate the image of God, you contemplate the icon as a way of drawing ever closer to God, ever closer to the image of God, cultivating the image of God in yourself. It's a very old Platonic idea, by the way, of becoming more and more like God through religious experiences and mystical experiences even, that we just don't appreciate. So I thought it was important to include this chapter as just to underscore that in this creed is embedded the idea that, no, you are something valuable and precious and moral and full of moral agency. And, this is something we need to embrace a little bit more robustly
That's
in
good.
American Christianity.
I love the comments the way you talked about our Abba Father parts of that. And good stuff. So chapter 4, I love chapter 4. There is no Jew or Greek. And I thoroughly appreciated the history background that you gave for Antioch and Paul's obscurity before Antioch, right? And then his encounter with the Jerusalem crowd. He's trying to have table fellowship with Jews and Greeks. But you gave the whole background of Greeks, Jews, and Romans that would have preceded that, which was really fascinating to me. And so that whole complexity of the Greek world, the Roman world, and the Jewish world, and how that came to play, and how Paul was radically trying to include table fellowship with the circumcised and the uncircumcised. Great history there. I just appreciated that. And this is really where Paul was passionate. This was probably what drove him. You tend to think that the other two statements he was a bit more ambiguous about, but this one is what he lived and died for. And you can't really understand Paul without understanding this.
Right.
In fact, the new Paul, the way you introduced the new Paul through this chapter, brilliant. I loved it. Like if nobody read. Oh, by the way, when I was at Southwestern in the 80s, W.D. Davies lectured at TCU, and I ended up meeting him.
Yeah.
I loved his Paul and Rabbinic Judaism. And of course, one of his students was Sanders.
Yeah.
And then got into the new Paul stuff through Sanders and then through N.T. Wright, but and other people. But I know it started before then. But I love the way you introduced the new Paul, and I think that shift, the Lutheran guy that you mentioned in your footnotes that was really the originator of originator of the new Paul stuff. Gosh, talk about that shift. Why does this creed lead to a fuller understanding of the new Paul versus the Reformation Paul?
Yeah. Well, the new Paul, the Reformation Paul said, let me just recall some phrases I used to use from lectures. The Reformation Paul thought that the justification by faith was all about saving sinners. And this was a solution to the universal problem of human sin, justification by faith. And Stendhal taught us that this phrase, justification by faith, is used by Paul always and only in one context, and that is where he's talking about the inclusion of Gentiles in Jewish communities. Mm-hmm. And the question is not how they can be saved from their sins, it's about how can they participate in these communities that Paul is forming without having to observe the Jewish law. And so that's basically the new Paul, that it's about inclusion. The justification by faith is about including Gentiles and creating a more diverse community, not about saving sinners from their sins.
Yeah, say that one more time, just because that's like the yellow bullet point, and people still can't get that, it's hard.
Yeah. Well, we think it's about us. We think that Paul is teaching us, and he's not. He had no idea that we would be sitting here reading his letters, thousands of years later. He's teaching, he's talking to people, he's writing to people in his own circle. And the problem he was having with people in his own circle was he was trying to include Gentiles in these communities. They were predominantly Jewish. And other followers of Jesus, like Peter and James and John, they were saying, "No, we're not going to do that. This is a messianic. Jesus is our Messiah, and the Gentiles will let God sort out the Gentiles later." But Paul said, "No, we have to start doing that now. We have to include Gentiles. And his idea was they can be justified by their faith in their trust in God, just like Abraham was. Remember, he uses that example in Romans and in Galatians. He says they can be justified just like Abraham was justified by his faith, his trust in God. That's how Gentiles can, because Abraham didn't have the law. He didn't follow the law. And that was all before the law. So Paul uses that argument to include Gentiles. But through Augustine and Luther, we learned that whole thing different. They had a different question. They weren't including, they were Gentiles. They were in.
Yeah.
Augustine wasn't worried about how to include Gentiles in these predominantly Jewish communities. In Augustine's day, the church was a Gentile church, and there weren't any Jews. He hated the Jews. He was about excluding Jews from the life of Christians. And so what's the problem that he struggled with? It was his personal sin.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he took Paul's language about justification by faith and made it an answer to that question. How can I, miserable sinner though I am, be saved? And his answer was through justification by faith. But, and I'm not saying that that's a wrong answer, that that's a bad way to read Paul, but it's not Paul. It's not Paul.
Yeah, the justification by faith is, hey, this is how you're included without being circumcised. I mean,
right.
It's an inclusive approach to community.
It's saying that you can have a community that's based on trust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you're not ethnically uniform, mm-hmm. and you don't have all the same cultural traditions to hold you together,
yeah,
and you don't have even rules and laws to hold you together, is there any possibility for having a community? Mm-hmm. And I think Paul's best insight was that yes, you can, and mm-hmm. But you have to trust. Trust is the heart of that new kind of community.
Yeah.
I wish he'd adhered to that insight more thoroughly over the years.
Exactly.
But we're all flawed, and he was flawed as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I found it fascinating too that I agree. I think that's the brilliance of Paul. I mean, if you just had to say if you didn't hate on Paul, right? Because of where he didn't go with slaves or women or all the other stuff.
Or just his annoying language. I mean, he's an annoying person. There's no doubt about it.
So if you don't hate on him and you just try to go, well, what was his brilliance? This is it. I mean,
it is.
This is Paul at his best, So
what I think most Pauline scholars, though, even today think, and this was true of most of the New Paul people, Stendhal was like this, and Sanders certainly was like this too. They think that Paul's insight was essentially a religious insight, that he was dealing with a religious problem, and this was a religious solution to it. The religious problem was the law, a part of Jewish doctrine or belief, if you will, and this was his way of solving that religious problem. And I've always been uncomfortable with that because it just didn't seem right to me. And for years, I've been looking at the historical situation in Antioch and the specific historical situation in the late 30s and early 40s in those cities of the Roman East. Mm-hmm. And I think it escaped most scholars' notice that those were very tumultuous times for Jews and Greeks in those cities. And Antioch itself probably saw one of the worst ethnic riots in the history of ancient Judaism, right about the time Paul was there, whether he was actually there when everything happened, or if it was, he came there afterwards in the aftermath, or those are details we'll never know. But in the late 30s, there was an ethnic riot, if you will, a race riot in Antioch involving Jews and Greeks. And many Jews were killed, many Greeks were killed. The city was destroyed, and the violence only ended when Rome, the Roman governor, after letting things run their course, probably to his own advantage, intervened and sent everyone back to their corners. And so when Paul comes to Antioch, it's not a nice, wonderful, beautiful city. It's a kind of a wreck. And the Jewish quarter was probably burned out, and many synagogues destroyed. Many Jews had been killed, and there was interethnic hatred of a high level. And so I think that's the background for Paul's insight, that there is no Jew or Greek. I don't think that he looked at the Jewish law and said, that's the Jewish law is a problem. We don't get that from Paul otherwise. I mean, he's perfectly fine with following the Jewish law on all things. The only thing he decides to lower the bar on is on circumcision. A little bit on dietary stuff, but not all that much, really. It's really circumcision. And so this is not a religious issue. This is a human issue. How do you address interethnic violence and the religious dimensions of it, the cultural dimensions of it? And Paul decides that, okay, we're going to have to set aside our stuff if we expect them to set aside their stuff. Yeah. And we can form a new community based on trust.
We can love the enemy, the other, through that trust and through that. Yeah.
Loving your enemy is the most transformative thing you can attempt to do.
I think so.
We learned that from Paul. We learned that from Howard Thurman.
And it's hard. It's not always easy, I mean, I love it because I want to live my life that way, but it's challenging at times,
It is hard, but one of my favorite texts in terms of modern theology is when we've been wounded by the other, right? When there's these violence, right? No, it's terribly hard.
Yeah.
But Howard Thurman, in his book Jesus and the Disinherited, points out that now Howard Thurman, for audience, if they don't know Howard Thurman, he was a mid-20th century African-American theologian and spiritual writer, taught at Boston University for many years, was very influential in the life of Martin Luther King Jr. His book, The Jesus and the Disinherited, is probably one of the most important books in African-American spirituality from the 20th century, widely read. He's addressing himself to African Americans, his fellow African Americans who are living under Jim Crow. And he says, these are people with their backs against the wall. And yes, fear is always there. And it will destroy you. And deception is always there, and it will destroy you. But when you are powerless, when your back is against the wall, one of the things that you can do that will restore agency to your own self, your own self-understanding, is the act of loving your enemy. Only you can do that, and nobody's going to dissuade you from doing it. And if you can find the wherewithal to do that, you will take the first step toward restoring agency and dignity and self-respect to yourself. And I think this is what Paul knows. This is what Jesus knows.
Yeah.
This is why Jesus says, love your enemies. He says that to the destitute, to the lowest of the low, to the marginalized, the outcast. And he knows that from that position, it's hard, but it is the only way to get some self-respect and dignity and agency restored to your own soul.
I just think it's so powerful and central to Jesus and I think to Paul. It was fascinating to me to see how you brought out Marcion's influence and how quickly this creed was forgotten and how quickly the context of this creed was forgotten. I love the work you did on the context of this creed, and then also showing how quickly it was forgotten and how it ended up turning into an anti-Semitic thing almost for a running history of Christianity, right? It's just crazy how that flipped on the context of Paul on this.
I think what gets flipped is Paul. I think the creed itself. I would say, you always learn things after you write a book, and one of the things I've learned is that the creed had more of an afterlife than I think it did, or that I said it did in this book, and so I missed some things, and so it does have a little bit more of an afterlife, and the creed so hangs around as a kind of minority report for longer than you might think. But Paul himself is turned against the Jews. So as soon as Paul becomes one of us, meaning one of us Gentiles, one of us Christians.
Yeah.
And our question is no longer how do we build diverse communities, Jew and Greek, but how do we differentiate ourselves as Christians over against Jews?
Right.
Then all that language that you find in Romans and Galatians from Paul becomes a real weapon for turning on Jews and saying we have a superior religion to Judaism or something like that, and which becomes part of a big anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic narrative in Western civilization, and that is a tragedy.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest tragedies. You're a quote from you, but if Paul's intentions count for anything, you have to say that this long, sad history of Christian anti-Judaism based on Paul is one of the greatest intellectual failures of Western civilization.
Yeah, I suppose we should add also moral failures.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we're not going to have enough time to get to all the stuff I wanted to get to, but it's interesting. This is the heart of why Paul put this creed in this letter, right?
Uh-huh.
Do you think would you date this letter to about 48?
Oh yeah, I guess Galatians is the most difficult of Paul's letters to date.
I know.
Some people
kind of go with the earlier dating.
Yeah,
I don't know. Anyway.
I used to teach it early in the sequence when I taught Paul regularly. I'd put it early in the sequence because this autobiography of Paul in the first part of Galatians explains so much of what he is about in his life as part of the Jesus movement. But whether it's early or late, I don't have a real take on it.
And then your chapter 5 on no slave and free, we won't do that. But Paul, it wasn't Paul's passion to take that, to tackle all of the history of slavery, it really wasn't his passion. And then I was hoping to get to the male and female part, but we're out of time. And, but your chapter 6 on the no male and female and the original androgynous views around Genesis was that was so intriguing to me. And then the other thing I thought was intriguing was if you don't give the pastoral letters to Paul, then this suppression of women leadership is late to the game in Christianity. Yeah,
it is. Yeah. I wish people would pay attention a little bit more to this gender stuff in early Christianity, especially because that's become such a part of our current cultural debate and dialogue and discourse. And Christians are participating in that discourse in a way that I think is really shameful. Kids who struggle with their gender identity, are mostly just different kids, and they struggle under all circumstances. And there's no sense in piling on and punching down on a group of people that is really vulnerable. Yeah. And if you read this stuff in early Christianity, you realize that many early Christians understood this very well, and understood that gender, and especially the hypermasculinization of gender hierarchy is is a real problem. And
yeah. Gender fluidity is, I don't know if that's a good way to talk about, but I mean, you figure God is represented as both male and female. He creates people in his image, male and female. So, I don't know. I agree with you on that whole front. We've done a lot of, and I grew up, we'll wrap up on this, but growing up in the Southern Baptist world, it was like, we didn't talk about LGBTQ stuff. It was just a sin to be a homosexual, and we didn't really delve into it that much. I can't remember all through my seminary career. I don't even think it came up one time in the 80s at my seminary. Literally, like, think about that.
Yeah.
Then I started pastoring in the 90s, and we were reaching people outside the church. And I literally for 30 years always had LGBTQ people in my church, but didn't know what to do. I didn't understand it. Yeah. We tried to get them into inner healing that was really kind of a Christian reparative therapy thing. And they would come and, they would be conflicted, and I would love, but I didn't know how to really help, you know what I mean? Because I just didn't understand it. And over time, over listening to just lots and lots of stories, I finally just had to start rethinking all of those issues. And I liked what you brought out about early Christianity. that to me was a really valuable part of some of your studies outside of the Bible itself in early Christian histories, is that little part of it wasn't always so gender rigid, right?
Right. I mean, people our age I think a lot of people our age must have lots of regrets. I certainly do have regrets about the way I've thought about and acted towards people who are different in terms of their gender or sexuality, different from the mainstream. And the way I've come to think about it, though, in terms of the Jesus tradition, is certainly that Jesus was himself open to all kinds. He was a marginalized person, and his whole thing was relating to people who were marginalized by their culture and convincing them, as he had been convinced himself, that they are also children of God. They are beloved of God. And so to turn this tradition on people and make them feel less than is just a terrible tragedy. And I know when I was younger, I never used the Christian tradition to ridicule or vilify gay people, but I had no sympathies for gay people, and until I went to college and started to meet people who were different from myself, and we just have to persist on this. There's just nothing to be gained from beating up on people who are different, except a false sense of solidarity and a perverse sense of power that has no place in Christianity.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you on that. I think that's a good way to wrap it up, though, because I think at the core of Jesus and like Paul at his best is this radical inclusion through trust and community, and realizing that there is a oneness in our humanity, but also beautiful diversity. And I think that's kind of what you're bringing out on your conclusion. Your book is the beauty of unity and diversity. And maybe that's what the Trinity is all about. Maybe that's why I often wonder, is that why Christianity stubbornly held to this crazy notion of a Trinity? I don't know. Unity and diversity, maybe. Perhaps
so.
I don't know.
One of the critiques of the book, sort of, I think, would have taken to task any time I talked about inclusion, in the sense that positions me or someone as in a position to include people, and that itself is a kind of hierarchical stance and privileged stance, and so I tried to use the word solidarity enough in the book to counter that. I think that's really what this creed is about. It's about solidarity that
Yeah.
that extends across ethnic, class, or gender lines.
Good. That's good. Yeah, good deal. Well, Steve, thank you so much for taking time to do this. I know I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and certainly is one that I would really encourage all of my pastor friends out here who happen to tune in to check out The Forgotten Creed, and you will learn some great stuff that you can teach, whether you embrace the whole thing or not. So,
and you should mention it's only 150 pages.
Yeah. Right.
It took us a long time to talk about it, but it's only 150 pages.
Yeah, and I could have talked a lot longer. So anyway, but no, thanks so much. I appreciate it. I love what you're doing. Thanks for your work. Thanks for your dedication to digging up some of these things and helping us along the way.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on your show.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning into Spirituality Adventures. We appreciate it, and we will see you next time. This concludes today's episode. Thanks for tuning in and listening. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Remember to like, share, or subscribe to the social media platform that you're using. And then go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, and make a one-time donation, or you can subscribe monthly and receive our special bonus content. Thanks so much.